Here's the thing, this is why they made Captain America so strong. When I grew up, Captain America, like I said, was an Olympic level athlete. About as fast as the fastest sprinter, good as the fastest acrobat, best boxer, that kind of thing. So, you know, basically he was a really strong guy, but he wasn't like Spider-Man, he could throw a car around or whatever. And I think they might go that way with this one, although they might not, we'll see. The analogy I was using was cavalry. I mean, obviously cavalry from, you know, the 3rd or 4th century all the way up until the early 20th century was a very decisive part of warfare, important to the Civil War and all that. You had people that were highly mobile, and that's why the knight jumps over everybody and when you're playing chess. And none of the other pieces can do that. And that's what cavalry represented. It represented an extreme amount of mobility. But then you came up with, you know, artillery and machine guns and things like that, which changed that. And all you would get if you had, you know, 1,000 cavalry charging was a bunch of dead horses. You know,
so that had to change.
So that had to change. It ended the idea of cavalry. But they recreated the idea of cavalry at some point after they created tanks. Essentially, you had horses, and that's why they call it armored cavalry. You had gigantic vehicles, mobile vehicles, that could punch holes in static fortresses, in static lines that men could not actually punch through because of good defenses, and could actually change the entire terrain of battle because now they're flanking, which is what they usually used horses for in the first place. You know, even in the Roman times, they would line up the two guys that are actually fighting, they'd bring the horses around the back, and all of a sudden you're fighting on two fronts and your army's broken up. Well, that obviously reestablished the idea of cavalry in combat in the mid-20th century. But there's no reestablishment of infantry. And that's, I think, what they really realized. That was the genius of the idea of the super soldier. That's why, instead of the Cold War that we know, where there's a race to develop nuclear weapons, we have the Ultimate Universe idea and the movies idea, which has a race to develop super soldiers.
In the preview, it shows different shields that Captain America has. He starts off with a lesser shield. And what's that about?
Yeah, I mean, actually, the shield looks more like a police officer's badge kind of shield. Not round. It's basically, it's got sharp edges. It's got a tip in the middle, and then it's got a sort of a rounded U bottom. Initially, you know, it goes with the idea of him being a soldier, not a superhero. In fact, there's no way that it would provide the kind of protection. I mean, for the moment, let's put aside the point that, in fact, a round shield is not going to provide much protection from machine guns, right? but the point is that the shield that he has is supposed to be essentially invulnerable, right? So the one that you see on his back, it doesn't seem like anything other than metal. It doesn't seem like it's intended to provide really much protection, except in a very superficial kind of way for somebody who's very strong and who can do combat in close quarters. But what it represents is, in fact, sort of a symbol of America that a soldier would carry to sort of symbolize this new guy on the field that would sort of drive his people on, sort of like a flag or a banner that you'd hold that people know they can rally to, rather than in fact anything that is that's very effective as a weapon against, you know, say, you know, grenade attacks or shells from tanks. You know, and so the point is that when they first start that's why they gave him a gun, which is, it makes perfect sense. I mean, our Captain America would never kill. The Captain America that I grew up with would never kill. Of course, no superhero would. In the 80s, they started to have superheroes who did that. But a Captain America who was fighting Nazis would kill. They never really thought of that. So obviously that came to them. And of course, any Captain America that wouldn't shoot a Nazi, it's like, you know what? You need to drop you know what I mean? If you're not going to kill Nazis, then you know what? We're done. You know, we're going to have to find somebody else for this job. There's morality, and then there's like, well, okay, no, wait a minute. But they're Nazis, you know. So,
absolutely.
Anyway, so much of this is inspired, I think, by all the thinking that went on in creating the Ultimates universe. I mean, obviously, the Ultimates universe has a Black Nick Fury, and you know, if you read it 7 years ago, it was very clear that was Samuel L. Jackson.
Pretty much anyone who's seen the superhero movies has seen that they're going with Samuel L. Jackson.
Right. In other words, but if you read the Ultimates comic book before they had any of the movies,
he was originally white.
Absolutely.
Right?
And in fact, Nicholas Fury originally was not only a white guy, but he was a white guy from the Second World War, and he was the head of a group called the Howlers. This before he was the head charge of S.H.I.E.L.D. So he was a white guy, and he knew Cap. You know, so like they were fighting the same bad guys and so forth, the Second World War. And then eventually, you know, we saw him in the 60s, and he was slightly older, he had a little white in his hair and that kind of thing. But no, at this point, the guy would be like 75 or 85 or 90 years old. So clearly, they're like, well, we're going to have to recreate this guy.
Right.
You know, so they chose to recreate him, but they thought about it, instead of creating creating him as a younger person, maybe who was in the Vietnam War, who was a white person.
Yeah.
They made him as a black person,
right.
which I think, you know, I think was brilliant. I mean, because my generation, they would just add heroes.
Yeah. And
the problem is, in my generation, you know, you'd only support so many comic books when you were like 14. You know, now people are like 40 and they're buying them and they have money. But so, you know, you could come up with one or two, but Captain America ended up with a buddy who was black, but he couldn't support his own comic book.
Nick Fury is obviously way cool as Samuel Jackson.
He was pretty, he was kind of James Bond, no, he was kind of, yeah, he was kind of Man from U.N.C.L.E. James Bond cool back then. And so he was very cool back then in many ways.
Right.
But this is cool, and you know, this is you know, this is like he wears black. He wears black. He's got an eye patch. Of course, Nick Fury had an eye patch, but he's just even cooler. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Ultimates version. What other kind of versions was it?
Well, you know, because obviously any comic book that's been going on for 50 years, especially America, right, is going to have all the impacts, or many of the impacts of America as it goes through those 50 years. So, for instance, when I was growing up, Captain America was just, you know, the symbol of America, he's good, and so forth. But then in the 70s, because this was the first experience people had, late 60s, 70s, was with the United States as like the bad guy, where, you know, Vietnam was a very traumatic experience, but people felt that, you know, there was many unjust aspects to it. There was a real difference of opinion among the youth, and a strong feeling that it was not a good idea and that it was not moral. And that was an interesting way to grow up. And of course, their Captain America had to reflect that. At one point, he actually gave up the badge. I mean, he stopped being Captain America, became a different character, Nomad, a man without a country. A nomad is a person who doesn't live anywhere. And, you know, kind of went to find himself, you know? I mean, that's the sort of post-Nixon, you know, kind of Captain America. I think that the Captain America that existed in the 50s,
there's a McDonald's on one block up if you want to go.
Oh, good, because we're basically at your home again, aren't we? That's a little interesting. Well, we did something. There was a Captain America that existed in the 50s, and after the 70s experience, when, you know, the Nixon White House was, you know, doing kind of disturbing and frightening things, you know, freakishly un-American, but in fact represented part of our tradition that we just hadn't come to terms with in our idealized sense of America. He had to sort of look back on this 50s Cap. You know, he'd been asleep because he'd been knocked out in suspended animation in the 50s, and then woke up in the 60s, early 70s. Captain America in the middle was a different guy. And that Captain America in the middle, in fact, was like a, you know, a supreme anti-communist, afraid of different people, you know, afraid of aliens, and, you know, in other words, representing a certain part of American culture.
Nice.
So, like, Captain America has really had to be evolved, because the fact is, our idea of what it means to be a good American has evolved. I mean, come on, we have a black president. I mean, you know what I'm saying? We have a black president. The idea
Real talk.
I mean, when people told me as a kid, and told everybody as a kid, you can grow up to be anything you like, everybody knew that, well, with the exception of if you're black, you can't be president. I mean, that was obvious, didn't even need to be said. It was just part of the sentence that was implied. So the point is that this still represents a culmination of a particular view of America, that we could have something like that, the impossible could happen. But you have to remember that, you know, 50, 60 years ago, basically we were injecting black men with syphilis to see what would happen. Just like the Nazis did the Jews. I mean, you know, just the same kind of thing.
The story of Captain America has such historical ties. That's
the main point. That's the main point.
That's what makes him such a great hero.
And of course, the ultimate universe has this. I mean, the thing that Marvel did that DC didn't do, when I was growing up, is that they were the first heroes that had like acne, couldn't get a date. You know what I mean? They kind of didn't have money, had to work part-time after school.
Right.
They were speaking to kids, and kids had those experiences. And so, you know, unlike the DC universe where like everything was perfect, you know, and there was no human weakness except, you know, bad things happened, but that's essentially it. Well, the Ultimate Universe was very much an answer to the sort of DC's recognition of that when they created the Dark Knight, which recreated their universe in a real terms. The Ultimate Universe had that same sense of like, well, we live in a post-9/11 world. What is that world going to look like? Well, that world would have basically a bunch of people who are sort of operating sort of as agents. Maybe like questionable borders. You know, the Avengers wouldn't just be this independent agency. They would be basically, you know, funded by the government. That there might be a Guantanamo Bay, essentially Triskelion, which is the name of the base that they keep all the bad guys at. You know, that they keep all the bad guys at. You know, sorry, we're just not letting you out. You know, and sort of questionable research where you're sort of playing both sides of the issue, and you know, like the fact is that in my universe, the Green Goblin was a bad guy. Everyone was very clear. He was rich, but he was a bad guy. You know, but then eventually there was an aspect in which he was also
redeemed, kind of, wasn't it?
Well, that's true, but no, that's very true. He did, but in some ways. But actually, there was his son that became the Green Goblin.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
And there's a story there, but that's not related to this. But what I'm saying is, in the Ultimates universe, the Green Goblin is essentially a government contractor, and you saw that in the Spider-Man comic book, right? I mean, he's trying to sell weapon systems to the government. You know what I mean? So it's not just that he's not a bad guy. It's like he's trying to create this because this is what the government wants him to do.
Yeah.
It's just harder than it looks. These guys in the Ultimate Universe are sort of working hand in glove with the government. Maybe Nick Fury is the only one who really knows where all the bodies are buried, and every once in a while one of the bodies gets out of the grave. And, you know, it's like a big disaster and a scandal because, you know, after all, we're not really supposed to be creating... It's like, wait, that guy killed like 14 people. You know what I mean? It's like, well, yeah, but he was working for us. I mean, he got out of control. It's like, in a certain sense, the government is both the bad guy and the good guy in a way that I think reflects America's feelings that, you know, we grew up in the 60s where America was always sort of good, even though that wasn't true. And then in the 70s we realized that America was sort of bad, even though that wasn't entirely true. And now we've sort of come to this conclusion that America is both good and bad, that they do evil things toward good ends sometimes, and they do foolish things with good intentions sometimes. And you see that reflected very much.
That's interesting.
Pushing Guantanamo. You know what I mean? There's evil things going on sometimes, but you can kind of understand why somebody might think that that was the right call to make, even though you disagree with that call. Very much like the DC universe did with The Dark Knight. Thinking about what it means to live in a universe where, you know, there's a bunch of really, you know, bad things going on, and that you're this genius and you've had these terrible things happen to you as a kid, and you're rich and powerful, and what would you do? Well, you'd grow up and you'd get big and strong, and you'd make sure it didn't happen because you're afraid. Then order, you know what I mean? That kind of thing. And you see a lot of that in DC. They've really gotten ahead in some ways. I mean, Lex Luthor was a wonderful idea. Here's a guy, you know, when I grew up, he was just a bad guy who was smart and had money.
Yeah.
And now he's somebody who's fighting, in his vision, a moral crusade against an alien who has stolen from humanity its own sense of its agency in its destiny, right?
Yeah.
Lex Luthor is like, I represent the human race. You're an alien. This isn't your city. This is my city because this is a human city, and we represent. You know, that's an incredible internalization of a larger theme that I think
it is.
We didn't have when I was a kid. The movies that you're seeing should be tapping into that, and it definitely represents what they've done in the Ultimates universe.
Yeah.
So that's what I got.
I'm Aaron Martinson, and this is Michael Martinson.